Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every decision you've made, the career you pursued, the friendships you maintained, the opinions you held was not entirely your own. Imagine discovering that the path you thought was uniquely yours had been paved long before you walked it, laid down by invisible architects, the expectations of society, the pressure of conformity, the invisible pull of the crowd. And then imagine a more unsettling truth. The most intelligent, the most visionary minds of history, those who saw further, thought deeper, and lived freer, almost always stepped away from that crowd. Not because they hated people, but because they understood something most never dared to confront. Here lies the paradox. Human beings are social creatures by nature. We seek belonging the way lungs seek air. Yet the sharpest minds, those capable of reshaping reality, seem to deliberately distance themselves from the very collective that claims to give life its meaning. Why? Why do the smartest people, philosophers, visionaries, mystics, scientists, and artists so often retreat into solitude? Why do they abandon the comfort of the group, rejecting the noise of collective approval? What secret do they perceive in the crowd that makes them turn away, even if it means isolation, loneliness, or even ridicule? The paradox grows heavier. When you realize this, the crowd does not just offer belonging, it demands obedience. It whispers in your ear how to dress, how to think, how to vote, how to love, and most disturbingly, what to fear. And the moment you stop listening, the crowd begins to turn against you, branding you as strange, arrogant, or dangerous. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to hold an opinion that contradicts the majority? Even when you know you're right, even when evidence is on your side, something inside you tightens with unease when the collective disapproves. It is as if your very survival depends on that approval. But why? And at what cost? The smartest people seem to recognize that. There is a hidden prison in crowds, a cage, not of iron bars, but of invisible pressures. Crowds offer comfort, yes, but at the price of individuality. They offer safety, but at the cost of freedom. Perhaps the greatest thinkers of history understood a brutal truth. To follow the crowd too closely is to vanish into it. Consider this haunting question. How many of your thoughts are truly your own? How many are echoes of what you have heard repeated often enough that you mistook them for truth? The smartest people avoid crowds not because they reject humanity, but because they fear something far more dangerous: the loss of authenticity. They know that truth is rarely found in consensus, but more often in the silent recesses of solitude. Think of Socrates, who chose death over betraying his truth. Think of Nietzsche, who declared that the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. Think of Van Gogh, who painted visions no one around him could understand. What unites these figures is not their brilliance alone, but their willingness to step away from the noise, even when it cost them dearly. And yet, this is where the paradox intensifies. The crowd mocks the solitary thinker, yet later worships them as prophet or genius. The very voices once dismissed as insane, antisocial, or arrogant are the ones engraved into history. So the question is not just, why do the smartest people avoid crowds? The deeper question is, what do they see in crowds that the rest of us are too blind or too afraid to notice? Is it possible that what we call belonging is, in truth, a disguised surrender? That what we call normalcy is, in fact, a slow erosion of self? As you sit with these questions, you may feel a quiet discomfort rising in your chest. Because deep down, you already sense the truth. It is easier to be accepted by the crowd than it is to be yourself. And perhaps that is precisely why so few ever dare to leave it. But if the crowd is a cage, then solitude, frightening though it may be, could also be the doorway to freedom. The problem is, most people would rather stay locked inside the familiar cage than walk through a door that opens into uncertainty. And this is where our journey begins, with the haunting suspicion that the very thing we cling to for comfort may be the very thing holding us back from greatness. The first time you step back from the crowd, something strange happens. The world feels eerily quiet, almost as if you've left a theater mid-performance. The laughter, the applause, the chancel of it fades, and in the silence you realize how loud it truly was. That silence, however, is not comfortable. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss of yourself. This is the problem most people avoid. The self is terrifying when stripped of collective noise. Carl Jung once wrote, "The crowd is the gathering place of the weak." True strength is found in the individual who can stand alone. Jung understood what so few dare to acknowledge, that human beings are terrified of themselves. Alone you are forced to confront the depth of your own fears, your contradictions, your mortality. Among others, you can drown these anxieties in distraction. But the smartest people, the ones who step away, recognize that the comfort of the crowd is a mirage. Soothe your anxieties at the cost of your authenticity. Nietzsche called this the herd instinct, a survival mechanism inherited from ages when being outcast meant death. For millions of years, conformity was safety. Those who stood out too much often perished. This ancient instinct still pulses in your veins, whispering, "Stay with the group, or you won't survive." But here is the hidden contradiction. What once ensured physical survival now threatens spiritual survival. You don't risk being eaten by wolves if you reject the crowd today. Instead, you risk something subtler, but equally terrifying: social rejection, alienation, ridicule. Your biology still treats this rejection as mortal danger. That's why your heart races when you disagree publicly, why you hesitate to voice a thought that challenges the majority. Arthur Schopenhauer once remarked, "We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people." It's a staggering truth. The hidden problem is not that the crowd exists, but that you lose yourself within it. You give away your originality, your depth, your capacity for independent thought, all in exchange for the shallow comfort of belonging. And here lies the root of the paradox. The smartest people feel this loss more acutely. Their minds are too sharp to ignore the suffocation. They sense how conformity bends the spine, how collective opinion erodes personal truth. For them, the crowd feels like a slow death. Consider Sartre, who argued that much of human existence is a game of bad faith, people lying to themselves, pretending to be something they are not, simply to fit the molds society sets. The waiter, who acts like a waiter because he believes that is all he is. The student who parrots the majority view because she fears being ostracized. These are masks we wear, but over time the masks fuse to the skin until the face beneath is forgotten. The smartest people are the ones who rip the mask off, no matter how painful it is. Yet ripping off the mask does not free you immediately. It exposes you. Without the collective, you are unprotected. Nietzsche knew this all too well when he warned that loneliness was the price of greatness. Solitude strips away illusions, leaving you face to face with raw existence. It is brutal, but it is also the birthplace of vision. Thinkers like Viktor Frankl, who endured the horrors of concentration camps, observed something profound. Those who survived were not always the strongest in body, but those who could hold on to meaning. Meaning is never given by the crowd. It must be forged individually. In fact, Frankl warned that conforming to the masses is often the quickest path to despair. The crowd may give you temporary distraction, but it cannot give you purpose. And so, the hidden problem reveals itself. The very thing that makes crowds comforting. Their ability to drown your fears is also what makes them dangerous. They don't just drown fear, they drown individuality. They smother the very flame of selfhood that makes life worth living. Here's the bitter truth. Crowds don't just influence what you do, they shape what you think is possible. They narrow your imagination, defining the boundaries of what is normal, what is acceptable. And once you internalize those boundaries, you become your own jailer. You censor yourself before anyone else even has to. This is why Aldous Huxley in Brave New World depicted a society addicted to conformity, pacified by shallow pleasures and collective consensus. In such a world, the deepest threat is not tyranny from above, but the quiet obedience of the many. And when you look around today, the endless repetition of opinions online, at the viral trends that everyone copies without question, don't you see the same danger creeping in? The smartest people sense this invisible trap. They refuse to surrender their imagination to the herd. They step away not because solitude is easy, but because conformity is unbearable. And yet this understanding is not comforting, it is haunting. Because once you see the hidden problem, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how often you betray yourself for the sake of acceptance. You see how your society rewards sameness and punishes difference. And worst of all, you realize how much of your own life has already been lived inside this invisible cage. The smartest people avoid crowds because they know what the crowd costs. They recognize that belonging, when purchased at the expense of authenticity, is nothing but a beautifully wrapped emptiness. And so they choose the harder path, the lonely road of self-confrontation, the brutal honesty of solitude. But here's the unsettling part. Once you understand this, you face the same choice. Do you continue to drown in the comfort of the crowd, or do you risk the silence of standing alone? This is the fork in the road. One path feels safe, but slowly erases you. The other feels terrifying, but may lead you to the only freedom that matters. And if you think this is merely a personal struggle, you're mistaken. The consequences ripple far beyond the self, because when crowds dominate, societies change in ways few dare to acknowledge. Stand still in the middle of a crowd long enough, and you will notice something unsettling. No one is truly still. People move, not always of their own accord, but as part of a greater current. The crowd surges, and each individual is swept along. Some convince themselves they are walking freely, when in reality, they are carried like leaves in a river. This is not just a metaphor for physical movement. It is a description of how the crowd shapes thought, culture, and even history itself. And here lies the tragedy. Most people never realize it is happening to them. The consequences of crowds are not always dramatic or violent. They are subtle, creeping, invisible. They don't strike like a hammer. They erode like water against stone. A single drop means nothing. 1,000 drops reshape the rock itself. The first unseen consequence is the erosion of originality. Think of a child. At birth, every child is a fountain of curiosity. They draw strange creatures, ask uncomfortable questions, imagine impossible worlds. But watch that child grow. Slowly, the crowd begins to whisper, "That's silly, that's wrong, that's not how we do things here." The questions become fewer. The drawings become predictable. The impossible worlds shrink into practical ones. The crowd has done its work, turning originality into obedience. By adulthood, most people no longer need the crowd to police them, they police themselves. They hesitate before speaking a thought that deviates from the group. They censor their own creativity before it can ever see daylight. And so, societies end up filled not with visionaries, but with copies of copies of copies. The smartest people see this happening and recoil. They know that once originality dies, progress dies with it. Every breakthrough in history came from someone who dared to deviate from Galileo pointing his telescope where the church told him not to look, to Rosa Parks refusing to move to the back of the bus. The crowd resists such deviations, but without them, humanity would remain stagnant, imprisoned in old patterns. The second unseen consequence is the distortion of truth. Crowds do not seek truth, they seek agreement. And agreement, as history shows, is often built on lies. Think of mass hysteria, which hunts propaganda machines. Once a lie is repeated enough, it becomes indistinguishable from truth in the minds of the many. This is why philosopher Søren Kierkegaard warned, the crowd is untruth. Your brain, wired by evolution to follow the herd, struggles to resist. Psychologists call this social proof, the tendency to believe something is true simply because many people believe it. If everyone is laughing, you assume something is funny. If everyone is outraged, you assume something unjust has happened. But the crowd's laughter may be cruel. The crowd's outrage may be misplaced. Still you follow because not following feels unbearable. Now imagine the scale of this distortion. Entire nations can march into war because the crowd believes it is noble. Entire cultures can persecute minorities because the crowd believes it is just. Entire civilizations can collapse because the crowd refused to question its own illusions. And here comes the third unseen consequence, the loss of responsibility. In a crowd, guilt diffuses. No one feels fully responsible because everyone is doing it. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the atrocities of the 20th century, called this the banality of evil. Ordinary people, swept up in collective movements, commit horrors they never would alone. Why? Because in the crowd, the individual dissolves. The I becomes we, and the we takes responsibility for everything and nothing. This is why some of the darkest chapters of history are written in the ink of crowds. From the Colosseum's blood-soaked sands to the mobs of revolutionary France, from book burnings to public executions, these were not the acts of lone madmen, but of masses, convinced of their righteousness. And yet, the consequences are not always written in blood. Sometimes, they manifest quietly in the small betrayals of self that happen every day. Consider the employee who disagrees with the unethical decision of a corporation but stays silent because everyone else is fine with it. Consider the student who hides their true beliefs in class to avoid disapproval. Consider the millions who scroll through endless feeds online, liking and sharing what everyone else does, shaping their identities not through reflection, but through mimicry. These are not trivial compromises. They are daily erosions of the self. The smartest people recognize this erosion. They see that when you surrender to the crowd, you don't just lose originality, you lose accountability, you lose truth, you lose the very compass that orients you in life. And when enough individuals surrender, entire societies lose theirs as well. But perhaps the most insidious consequence of all is this: the crowd rewards compliance and punishes authenticity. The obedient are praised as normal, while the dissenters are labeled as difficult, arrogant, or delusional. And yet, history flips the script. Those once mocked become revered. Those once shunned become prophets. Tragedy is that this recognition almost always comes too late after the visionary has suffered, after the truth-teller has been silenced, after the artist has died. So here we are, living in the tension between comfort and truth, between safety and freedom. The crowd offers you a warm blanket, but at the cost of your fire. The solitary path offers you flames, but they may burn you before they illuminate. This is the dilemma the smartest people face and why they so often walk alone. They choose flames over blankets, knowing that only in the fire of solitude can something new be forged. But once you see these consequences, the question becomes urgent. If the crowd is so dangerous, how do you resist it? How do you stand alone when every instinct in your body screams for belonging? The answer is not simple. It is not easy. It requires a rebellion not against others, but against yourself. And that rebellion begins with the courage to step away. Breaking free from the crowd is not a polite act. It is not gentle, and it is rarely celebrated. To walk away from the collective is to risk being misunderstood, mocked, even hated. Yet history shows that rebellion of this kind, the rebellion of authenticity, is the only path to true freedom. But here's the unsettling truth. The rebellion begins not with others, but with yourself. The first step is silence. Not the shallow silence of scrolling through a muted phone, but the terrifying silence of being alone with your own thoughts. Most people cannot bear this silence because it unmasks them. The crowd is noisy for a reason. It covers the hollowness within. To sit in solitude, to strip away the distractions, is to hear the raw, unedited voice of your soul. That voice will not flatter you. It will show you your fears, your hypocrisies, your unfulfilled longings. But only by confronting that voice can you begin to reclaim yourself. This is why Nietzsche insisted that one must become who you are. It sounds simple, but it is perhaps the hardest command ever given. To become yourself means to tear away layers of expectation, conformity, and conditioning until only the authentic core remains. And that tearing hurts. The second step is resistance. Every time you resist the pull of the crowd, something inside you strengthens. It may begin with something small, refusing to agree when everyone else nods along, refusing to laugh when the joke cuts cruelly, refusing to echo the opinions you don't truly believe. These moments feel dangerous because your ancient biology whispers, if you stand apart, you will be cast out. But each act of resistance teaches you a profound truth: you will not die without the approval of the crowd. Carl Jung once observed that the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege must be earned through resistance. And resistance is not glamorous. It will not make you popular. In fact, it may isolate you. But isolation, when chosen, becomes a crucible. It burns away falsehood and leaves behind strength. The third step is vision. The crowd lives in the present moment, intoxicated by immediate approval, immediate validation, immediate belonging. To break free, you must see further. Vision means imagining a life not dictated by others' expectations, but shaped by your own truth. Vision requires imagination strong enough to endure ridicule. When Galileo looked at the stars, he saw a reality no one around him wanted to accept. His vision isolated him, but it also reshaped the world. Visionaries endure loneliness not because they love it, but because they see something beyond the horizon that the crowd cannot. If you wish to break free, you must ask yourself, what do I see that the crowd does not? What truth burns within me, even if the world laughs? The fourth step is courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear. When Rosa Parks refused to stand, when Socrates refused to renounce his questioning, when countless unknown individuals throughout history chose authenticity over conformity, they all felt fear. But they also knew that surrendering to the crowd would be worse than any punishment. And here's the paradox. True courage is often quiet. It does not always roar in protest. Sometimes it whispers no when everyone else says yes. Sometimes it chooses solitude over applause. Sometimes it looks like the refusal to betray yourself, even when no one is watching. But rebellion is not merely withdrawal. To break free is also to create. The smartest people do not simply walk away from the crowd. They build something new in the silence. Van Gogh painted visions no one around him could understand. Kafka wrote stories so strange that even his closest peers could not accept them. Their rebellion was not just rejection, it was creation. And here lies the essence of freedom. When you stop living for the crowd, you start living for creation. Start shaping meaning, truth, and beauty. Not for approval, but for authenticity. This is why the solitary often become artists, philosophers, mystics. Their rebellion births worlds that the crowd could never imagine. Yet let us not romanticize rebellion. It is brutal. It is lonely. Sometimes it destroys before it builds. But the alternative, the quiet suffocation of conformity, is far worse. To live without rebellion is to live without yourself. How? Does one truly break free? You begin by daring to listen to the silence. You strengthen yourself by resisting small acts of conformity. You nurture vision by asking questions no one else dares to ask. And you cultivate courage by choosing authenticity, even when it costs you approval. Step by step, you build a self that no crowd can erase. And when enough individuals rebel in this way, the world changes. Because the greatest revolutions are not carried out by armies, but by individuals who refuse to betray themselves. One person's rebellion can ripple outward, awakening others to their own hidden chains. But here's the final test of rebellion. Once you break free, you must resist the temptation to build another crowd. Even visionaries fall into this trap. They gather followers, and those followers become a new herd, with new rules, new dogmas. The cycle repeats. To truly stay free, you must remain vigilant, resisting not only the crowd outside, but also the crowd that forms around your own ideas. This is why the smartest people never fully surrender themselves to any collective, even those that celebrate them. They walk alone, not out of arrogance, but out of recognition. Freedom dies the moment you give it away, even to a crowd of admirers. So ask yourself, what would rebellion look like in your life? What comfort would you have to abandon? What truth would you have to speak? What loneliness would you have to endure? The rebellion is not dramatic, it is not glamorous, but it is necessary, because only in rebellion does the self emerge. Once the self emerges, something deeper begins to stir, something that leads not just to freedom, but to the ultimate truth. There comes a moment, after the rebellion, when the silence of solitude no longer feels like emptiness, it begins to feel like space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to exist without the suffocating weight of approval. And in that silence, you discover the final, most powerful truth. Freedom is not found in the crowd, nor in being against the crowd. It is found in transcending it altogether. The smartest people avoid crowds not because they despise humanity, but because they understand that identity built on the crowd is no identity at all. The crowd offers belonging, but belonging is not the same as being. To truly exist, you must be willing to exist alone. Here lies the ultimate paradox. The more you try to be like everyone else, the more invisible you become. The more you step away from imitation, the more fully alive you feel. But this realization cuts deeper than personal identity. It changes how you see the world itself. Because the crowd, for all its noise, is fragile. Its truths are temporary. Its values shift with time like shadows chasing the sun. What was praised yesterday is mocked today. What is sacred today will be discarded tomorrow. The crowd worships idols until the moment it burns them. And if your life is built on the approval of the crowd, then your life too will crumble with its shifting tides. The smartest people see this impermanence and refuse to anchor themselves to it. They search instead for what endures. Viktor Frankl called this the will to meaning, the deep human drive not just to survive, not just to belong, but to find something worth living for. Something that cannot be taken away even in the darkest conditions. The crowd cannot give you this meaning because the crowd itself has no meaning. It moves, it changes, it consumes, but it does not endure. Meaning is born in the depths of solitude, in the confrontation with yourself and the universe. It is in those moments of terrifying silence, staring into the abyss of your own existence, that you find truths no crowd could ever provide. And this is why the smartest people avoid crowds. They know that the deepest truths are whispered only in solitude. Nietzsche captured this when he wrote of the Bermensch, the individual, who creates values for themselves rather than inheriting them from the herd. This figure is not enslaved by what the crowd declares good or evil, right or wrong. Instead, they forge their own compass, their own horizon. Such a person is terrifying to the crowd because they cannot be controlled, cannot be swayed by shame or ridicule. They stand outside the game entirely. But here's the secret: the crowd never wants you to know. This freedom is available to you as well. It does not require genius. It does not require fame. It requires courage, the courage to walk away, to stand in silence, to choose authenticity over approval. The smartest people are not born with some secret immunity to the crowd. They simply choose again and again to endure the loneliness of freedom rather than the comfort of chains. And what happens when you do this? Something extraordinary. At first, you feel alone. You fear you've lost everything. But then, gradually, you discover a new form of connection, not the shallow bond of conformity, but the profound connection of authenticity. When you live truthfully, the people who are drawn to you are not drawn to a mask, but to your essence. These connections are fewer, but infinitely deeper. You no longer belong to the crowd, you belong to yourself, and in doing so, you discover the rarest kind of belonging, one rooted in truth, and then comes the ultimate freedom. You realize you never needed the crowd at all. All along, the approval you sought, the validation you craved, was an illusion. The only approval that matters is your own. The only validation that lasts is the alignment between your actions and your deepest convictions. This is the final realization. The crowd is a test. It tempts you with comfort, but the price is your soul. If you resist, if you dare to walk away, you discover that everything you thought you needed, the applause, the approval, the acceptance, was nothing compared to the power of living in truth. And once you taste that freedom, there is no going back. See the crowd for what it is, a restless sea of voices, each afraid of silence, each terrified of themselves. And though you may walk among them, you no longer belong to them. We're free. So why do the smartest people avoid crowds? Because they know that in the noise of the many, the self disappears. Because they know that comfort without authenticity is a slow death. Because they know that the only way to live fully, to live deeply, to live truthfully, is to step away. And now you know too. The question that remains is not about them, is about you. Will you continue to live for the crowd, dissolving into its endless noise? Or will you choose the silence of authenticity, the loneliness of freedom, the rebellion of becoming who you truly are? Smartest people have already chosen. The choice now belongs to you.